I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, honoring the life of Dan David, the father of APTN.
My name is Dan David, and my Mohawk name is Cierra Bettens, and I'm a writer, a freelance journalist, and a media trainer.
David has been across the country and around the world. On APTN's 20th anniversary, he spoke with host Rick Harp about the realities facing Indigenous journalists in Canada.
So before APTN, I could only dream of an all-Indigenous newsroom. And I'm wondering what it was like for you to work in places like CBC and TVO and be most likely one of the very few, if the only Indigenous person in that space.
It was lonely. Yeah, there was you were always judged slightly deficient, not good enough, because you were a token hire, because you were, an employment equity person, hired because of the color of your skin, not your skills or experience. So you had to prove yourself, and you had to work twice as hard. That's the cliche, but it's also very true. You had to work twice as hard and work twice as long to be accepted as a journalist.
Was there ever the infamous quota, "Thank you, we have enough Indigenous stories this month"?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that happened all the time. In a place like Regina, Saskatchewan, of course, they're all looking at stories that are going to mean something to their audience, and we weren't part of that audience. Our people were north of the tracks in Regina, and so everybody else, farmers out in, Melfort, Saskatchewan, they were part of our audience, but not people over at Cody Reserve out near Manitoba or even Capel Valley. No, they just weren't part of our audience. And I went around and asked a whole bunch of people in various newsrooms why we did so badly covering Native issues. And they said, well, one person was really quite honest about it. Says, because they don't buy advertising. If they don't buy advertising, then why should we cover them? Newspapers, radio, television, CTV, CBC, Global, it didn't matter.
That was their public.
That was their public. That was their target audience. We weren't part of it.
David made it his life's mission to change how Indigenous stories are told in the media. On January 12th, he passed into the spirit world at the age of 73 after living with cancer. David's journalistic vision took him from his home in Kanesatake, Mohawk territory to newsrooms around the world. Throughout his 45-year career, he reported for CBC and produced for TVOntario and VISION TV. He also spent a decade in South Africa, training journalists and rebuilding newsrooms post-apartheid. Then, in 2000, he co-launched InVision News, which is now known as APTN National News. There are many things to say about David's life and legacy. So, to hear more, I'm joined by two of his close friends and former colleagues, APTN producer Bruce Spence and APTN senior online reporter and host of Nation-to-Nation, Karyn Pugliese. Karyn, Bruce, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, it's quite an honor. Thanks.
So I wanted to start by asking you both how you crossed paths with Dan David. What was your first impression of him?
Well, you know what? I used to be, when I was in my early 20s, I went to Ottawa. I took my my young family, which just consisted of my former wife, Valerie, and my oldest daughter, Leslie May. And I was working for various places there, like Indian Affairs, they used to publish a newspaper called the Indian News. I worked with a fellow named Gilbert Oscaboose there. But there was a community of people that worked for government. They worked for the National Indian Brotherhood. They worked for the Native Council of Canada. They worked for the Métis National Council, Inuit organizations, which they didn't have names back then that I remember. Dan was part of that community. Dan was one of the first Mohawk people that I had ever met, and this was circa 1978, 79. And he was a tennis player. Like most of the guys from around there played a lot of tennis. And we gathered at a place called the Black Bottom just about every work day. It was at the La Gondola restaurant on Bank Street. And it was raucous down there. It was full of people who were working for the feds or working for the organizations. Jack Anawak was there, Peter Itinoir, Art Manuel, regulars. And that's where I got to know Dan. And later on, I finagled my way into the program in journalism for Native people at the University of Western Ontario, now called Western Ontario University now or something. And because I knew the coordinator of the program, Lloyd Tataran, who let me in. So I did my year there, and the second class coming in, Dan was part of it. And I was very surprised that he was there. Garnet Anchiganem, God rest his soul, was also one of the other people that I know. So I listened to Dan on the radio on CBC. His radio documentaries were explosive. They were very well produced, very well written, very well voiced in that calm, steady voice of Dan's. And I was a little bit jealous of him, to tell you the truth. Fast forward to the year 2000, I heard about the APTN gig and I got my resume in at the last minute. Apparently, what Dan told me was that he saw my name on there and he remembered me. So here I am. I would not be sitting here today right now after 26 years with APTN if it wasn't for Dan David. He saw something in me that I probably never saw myself, and here I am. And he was part of that first crew. Like there was 10 or 12 of us up in that room on the 5th floor upstairs here, along with Tim Knight, and they taught us stuff like journalism. I thought I had a background in it already, but they took it and they developed it into us as a very coherent, cogent team of journalists. And I imagine he used the same stuff. Him and Tim, who also taught in South Africa, I think they used the same stuff on us as they used it as the people in South Africa. And here I am, 26 years later. Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'll just say, picking up on that, I would not have had a career in journalism if not for Dan. I had gotten pregnant during J school, and it meant that I was limited into, where I could move. I had a young child, and I wasn't with his father, but his father was very involved. So you don't move to another town like a lot of young people would move to another town, a small town somewhere, and work for peanuts and work their way up to some real position in legacy media, and I just couldn't do that. So, I'd gotten a job in at the civil service, thankfully not not Indian Affairs. I was at a Statistics Canada doing, technical writing, and, this what happened was, there was, an Eastern producer that Dan had hired, and he was looking for more Indigenous people with journalism degrees. And there was somebody, Jennifer David, no relation to Dan, who's working communications in at APTN, who had gone through Carleton University. And she reached out to Carleton University and said, were there any other Indigenous people in the program? And one of my television professors said, yeah, we graduated this person, Karyn. The only thing is, she doesn't look Indigenous. Does that matter? And she said no. So the professor called me up and said, you should apply. They seem to be very serious about hiring people, and they don't even care what you look like. Which I I only understood kind of what he meant later, because I am on the pale side. Um, so Dan didn't hire me in, but if there was no APTN, I would have no career in journalism, because Ottawa, where I was trying to find work, is one of those places where there's a long lineup of journalists who already work for CBC, who already are established in the media, who are trying to get there because it's considered to be a good city to work in because of the proximity to the Hill. So when I first met Dan, he kind of came in to scope me out because he was surprised that they'd hired a student. I'd gone back in to do my master's of history. And he said, we weren't ready to take on students yet. And I said, no, 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 I'm a real journalist. Like I actually graduated. I just couldn't find work anywhere. So I went back into school because I didn't know what to do with myself. And Dan really talked to me about it, the work that he and Bruce and the other journalists he had originally hired had done in thinking about what news should be. And he would talk over and over again about his vision. And to us, it all became Dan David's vision for news, very much informed by his time in South Africa and his idea of doing things differently. But he had built it with the team. And I think two things just immediately struck me was that I wasn't expecting to walk into any news organization and have the big boss pay direct attention to a little wet behind the ears green journalist. Um, but he had like long conversations with me and sat me down, and I mean, I felt very formal about it, and he was just very relaxed. And later on, there'd be training weeks and stuff where it didn't matter how junior you were. It didn't matter how small you were, it didn't matter how new you were. Dan thought that everybody's ideas matter, and he took you very seriously, and took your input very seriously. So that really struck me about him, and I learned a lot about leadership off of him from watching him behave that way, which I think came from, like his traditional Mohawk roots. And then of course, I'd grown up during the area where apartheid ended, and I think I read a lot by Biko, who is an activist there, and a lot of what Dan was saying about discrimination and setting up something of our own really sat with me because I remember one part of Biko's book where he talks about he says something like, "You damn liberals want us to go sit at your table." And we don't want to sit at your table. We want to smash your table, build our own table, and we will invite you to sit at it. And to me, that's what Dan was doing in news, and it all seemed very revolutionary. We weren't looking for a seat at the CBC table or at the Citizen table. We weren't asking people kindly to be let into the industry. We were building our own thing, and then he would describe news as a table that our people sat around. People would walk in to a community around a kitchen table and have all these conversations, and that's what he wanted news to be. So I felt like I immediately got what he was saying, and over the years he would talk more and more about South Africa and how it influenced him, and how that influenced the news that he was building.
So, Bruce, back in 2000, you and Dan co-launched APTN National News together. What can you tell us about the beginnings of that journey?
I think I would give more credit to Dan and Tim Knight for doing that because they facilitated this group of very diverse thinkers and doers into a unit that was able to put together eventually after a month in the same room, eventually able to put together a newscast, which was quite a remarkable feat for him to do. It was what is news to us, and we did have a conversation as a group about well, somebody suggested it's like sitting around the kitchen table and you're explaining to your grandmother what the story is and who the people in it are and what's happening. And it was all very basic, but it was all the fundamentals of journalism. And the other part of it was just figuring out what each other's talents were and where to use them. A couple of people were more into the technical aspects of the job, and the majority were reporters. So here's how you do a story. Here's how you focus a story. All of the fundamentals were there. And a lot of that stuff I picked up at Western Ontario as well, and I'm sure so did Dan. So that's basically what it was like in the beginning, and it all culminated with the taping of our first broadcast, which was a half-hour newscast that went to air in March of 2000. And just getting to that point was a task, and then just watching the thing go out there was very satisfying. And I think Dan was very proud of us at the time, and probably should have been anyway.
Hmm. So, you know, going back, what realities were Indigenous journalists facing, you know, prior to the launch of APTN when you, Dan, and other journalists were in the field?
There was a couple of areas. Was it just getting into the bleep bleep newsrooms? I was an experiment at CBC in 1983, and they got me in there to do some general assignment TV reporting for the local newscast. And they found out I was fairly good at it. And then another fella came along, Jim Compton. They put me in radio. They put Jim in TV. And Jim did not have a very good experience. I wasn't there every day, so I can't speak to that. But I know from my own experience, working in a radio newsroom was it was okay, but there were times when I felt that I would say what I wanted to say anyway, but it was not accepted. Oh, here's a story about archaeology. Somebody found a site that's 10,000 years old. You know, it says, yeah, that's a good story. That reminds everybody here who was here first. You know, and then nobody would talk to me for a week. Needless to say, I was not brought back after my year contract ended, and I went out into the other world to freelance and do other things like that. Now, the other aspect of that is just getting a leader from the Indigenous communities to take you seriously, or even just to get onto a reserve, you know, or should I say onto a First Nation, because you know, we were welcome there if we're doing a story that says this chief is a great leader and the dam he is building is going to help everybody in throughout Christendom. That's fine. But if you're saying, hey, what happened to that 10 million bucks that was sent over for healthcare? It seems to have disappeared. Do you know anything about that? Well, man, you know, and even at APTN, we had an investigative unit. Um, People were run off the road into the ditch by people sent out by a chief. Karyn can attest to that, you know. So there was all those things, and because we were given the fundamental tools by Dan, we were able to carry on and keep moving. And some of us are still moving in that direction today.
And how do you think Dan did journalism differently?
Well, there are some things, as Bruce pointed out, that he did the same. And I think a lot about this when we're talking about decolonizing news today. And I hear young people talking about it. The first thing I want to ask them is like, well, take a look and tell me what's not working about news. Like, what do you mean? Because I feel like perhaps they're throwing too much out. Dan kept a lot of the Western standards of journalism, like verification. Um, you know, like the practices that you go through for balance. He would be critical of our own communities. We weren't there to cheerlead for our own communities. We were there to report the truth. And he said, you know, like he thought that Indigenous journalists would want to be honest in their communities, and things don't get better unless you do talk about the things that aren't working. And, you know, to Bruce's point, that's where we felt a lot of pressure. One of the first stories that I ever went out to cover, it was the first story I went out to cover, as a matter of fact, was on some people who were protesting um, their chief's decision to participate in um, uh, like an agreement to harvest trees. So it was essentially like one of those deals that you hear about all the time where the chief and band council sign it and sign an agreement with industry. And people are saying, no, they're cutting too much and they're ruining the hunting fields, where, like hunting and trapping lines. Like, we're not behind this. And it splits the community. So I called the band office and they said, there's no story here and we're not speaking to you. And I went down and I talked to the people who are blocking the roads anyway. And they wrote to Dan and said, how dare she go into our communities and speak to our people without our permission? And Dan said, I think we're going to get this a lot, but I wouldn't ask the mayor of a town if it's okay to speak to people in the town about one of their policies. And that really influenced me. Like, when I had power, was managing a newsroom, I'd say we don't need permission to go in. And that's very different from what some non-native outlets do. If a chief tells them not to go in to this day, they don't go in there. And there is no traditional law that I know of about shutting up your people. That is colonized BS. And Dan saw through that. I think there were some other, like, just tiny things, that he felt we need to be more people-centered, not so expert-centered. People are experts on their own lives, and he would often say, um, that we needed to give, that it wasn't balanced to give, like, a lay person or an auntie or a chief, like, equal time in the story to, say, a minister of Indian Affairs, because a minister has 1,000 monkeys and 1,000 typewriters all, like, working to give him that perfect 8-second soundbite, whereas some of our people take longer to express themselves because that's our way. Like, just the way we talk, we tend to tell stories in a very circular way. We like to include a lot of context in our stories. And he said all that needs to have space in it. So, give the minister his 8-second soundbite that he's had 1,000 people working to perfect, but give our people space to express themselves, however imperfectly and with their context. And he was very heavy on context. Our original stories were like between 2.5 and 6 minutes long, and they weren't wasting your time. They were packed full of information. So these were all things that were very different than if you watched mainstream news coverage of Indigenous people. And, largely sometimes it was just that we believed people, or we knew how to fact check, or we actually knew what the context was. Because there was a lot of bad reporting. There was a lot of reporting very much focused on things like chiefs say there's a problem with water, chiefs say there's a problem with housing. And it kind of would start to get traction because journalists in mainstream would go, "Ooh, that housing looks bad. Oh, it's bad that you don't have clean water." And then the government would come along and say, "Well, we already give them $5 million or $10 million for that." And then the reporters would say, "Oh, well, there's no story. That obviously the chiefs are misspending the money." And that would be the end of it. Like, they wouldn't investigate where that money went or how it got spent or why it wasn't enough. How much did Canadians get in comparison was not a question that they asked. And so we were really encouraged to, like, always question everything. And if we found that, our chiefs or our leaders or our people were wrong, report that too. Like, it was really like looking for the best, like looking for the truth as best we knew it. And, taking our time to do it and giving people space to tell their own stories.
That's absolutely bang on. And if I may take that into my own context, Dan would tell us, we break the rules here. We're not going to do a 45-second story. Let your people you're talking to talk. And as a result, we did longer stories. And like Karyn said, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 if it was really something. And yes, and we went to air with that. And I'm sure there were reporters and editors and producers in the mainstream bunkers down the street that cringed when they saw our story was longer than 35 seconds. But
There were also a lot of people who were jealous of it,
yeah,
Bruce.
right. Yeah, that's true. And so that's what Dan was about. And we ran with that. I think we're all in agreement with that. And we all did it. We didn't wear a suit and tie for our stand-ups, you know. Some of us wore outrageous hats, you know. It was just I don't want to use the F word, but screw you, mainstream media. We're the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and this is us. So
And that's so Dan too, because when you say that, I can just see him like holding his two middle fingers up in the air and going, "Screw you, mainstream media!" Like that's exactly that's exactly something Dan would do or Stan would say. He was always giving people the finger.
yeah, he left us too soon, man. That was a shock. Even though kept up with him, he would come here every other year for training week, where he would impart his knowledge and wisdom to the rest of us who weren't here in the beginning. He left too soon. We kept track on Facebook. We even conversed sometimes on Facebook. We knew he was not 100% well, but to hear that he had passed was, to me, was very sad and very shocking.
Bruce, so I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, and that was about, Dan being in Africa in 1994 to train journalists. And I'm wondering, what did he share with you about that time and how it impacted him?
There was not, from my recollection, there was not a lot of Dan talking about South Africa. Like, we knew he was there. He told us he was there. Sometimes he would give us a little anecdote about some of the stuff that he was doing there. I was more focused on my world, and if there was anything that came out of the South African experience into our experience, it was not that pronounced for me. I learned more about what Dan was doing in South Africa when I read the one of the people that he taught, Sylvia, whom I've never met, but she put out a really extensive blow by blow account of her experience with Dan in South Africa. And I didn't know that there was a South African Broadcasting Corporation reporters in with you know these Afrikaner colonizers in with the people who had been colonized in the same room. I mean, that must have been quite a job to keep them from each other's throats, considering everything that was done to the tribal people of South Africa by the ruling class, and to witness the upheaval that the riots and the armed conflicts, with the jailing of Nelson Mandela and the freeing of Nelson Mandela. Those folks had it rough, and for him to be in that environment and to be able to function and to make these two opposing entities function, more or less functionally as opposed to dysfunctionally, that's tremendous feat. And maybe he should get the Nobel Peace Prize for that kind of work,
Karyn, one of the moments that you highlight in your tribute story is the 1990 siege of Gunasatake, which is where Dan grew up. And, rather than seek him out for his connection to the community, he was dismissed by news agencies as unobjective. How did Dan challenge that notion of objectivity that media outlets were weaponizing against Indigenous journalists?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually know a lot about that time on his life until recently. I was working on a audio documentary about well, it was the long version of it. It was a overall about land back, but that particular chapter was about media's role in land back, and there was quite a fight behind the scenes that happened in 1990 in between reporters who wanted to get behind the lines and bear witness to what was happening because they felt like the army was going to hurt uh, the Mohawks who were on the land defense, and they wanted to be there, to create a record of what would happen. And sometimes when media's there, also, police and military behave a little bit better than they would if media's not there. And so I was there to kind of talk about that war for the story and how it played out and what the role of media was in that siege. And so I went down with a CBC reporter, Lorraine Pindera, who had covered it for CBC, still lives in Montreal, and maintained a relationship with Dan and with the community. And Dan's cabin that he was living in later years and up until he passed, was just a few feet from where everything that had unfolded on TV happened, where people had dug in trenches and where the army had put up barbed wire. And so he took me for a walk through there and for a walk through the pines. And he talked about, being amongst the gentle pines very much in his old age, which was a little poetic for Dad, which he typically wasn't. And it was there standing under those trees that he told me, like really how he felt shut out, how he felt like he was being told he wasn't a reporter. And it's weird to think about because nowadays it's changed so much, and I think Dan's showing what Indigenous journalists can do when we have relationships with community. We need to keep our distance from community. Like, I mean, when we're covering somebody, like he would say, we're not cheerleaders, and we've got to be very clear with them about what we're doing. But that we have knowledge that other reporters just stepping blind into a situation don't have. And Dan could not make that clear to media at the time. He'd go on to publish some essays in this magazine, which were, which was an alternative magazine like 5 years later, that are just like these really powerful points of view about what happened and, sort of how it relates to the bigger world. One of them, he starts out about the fact he was born in Syracuse, New York, and he didn't have a Canadian passport. I think there was problems finding his birth certificate, actually. And he ended up going on a visit to a queen, which he records in this one story where he's back and forth between the action that took place at Oka in 1990 and the devastation on his family. And he kind of winds this narrative of his own journalistic journey through it. And it ends with this remarkable moment where he meets the queen, and she goes, "Oh, you're not one of those bad Indians, are you?" And he says, "Yes, ma'am, I'm afraid I am."
I remember that
And that
story.
anecdote,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I asked him, and that's true. He did meet the queen. She did ask him that, and he did say that is actually a true story of Dad. And so when he was making APTN, he was like, "We're gonna be better at it because we have the connections to the community." He didn't say, "Oh, you're Algonquin, so you can't go cover like Algonquin stories." I mean, we knew if we were involved in something, for example, if I was giving my chief help personally about what I thought he should or shouldn't do with the land claim, that I probably shouldn't cover that. We could let another reporter cover that. But even when our own family was involved in things, we could talk to them, so long as we were honest with the audience. This is my family. Somebody in my family died, and I'm going to tell you that story in a very different way, in a very personal way, right now. And so it was just you never try to trick the people who you're talking to, right? You're always very honest with them. And yeah, so he had a completely different view on this, which now we're seeing finally, like all these years later, people just start talking about these things that Dan was like 20 years, 30 years ahead of, where people are now like, "Oh, well, it kind of helps that you have connections to the community and we don't have any, and you seem to understand what's going on there. So maybe you should write about it." Whereas before they would have said, "Oh, well, you're completely biased." They saw just information that we had or context that we had as biased. And I think a lot of the work that Dan set up at APTN, even after he left, subsequently we kept to his vision for a long time. And when social media started, people who were other reporters and people who weren't Indigenous, I think, really started to see our stories and see how different they were from mainstream. And mainstream started realizing they were getting them wrong, that they were reporting things that just weren't true because they misunderstood or because they didn't have all the facts. And, a lot of things like even CBC Indigenous opening up, I don't think that would have happened if there wasn't an APTN first.
Yeah, a lot of our people went over there.
That's something though that Dan didn't mind. Like he talked to me about that. It was good.
Hmm.
It's like we will infiltrate them with
Yep.
our own people. you
Yep.
know? They won't know what hit them. I always think about it like there's if anybody who listens to Star Trek out there, there's this, it's Star Trek: The New Generation, there was the Borg, and it was like that big box that would go around assimilating cultures. We will assimilate you. Resistance is futile. And we'd all joke as like Indians, like that was Indigenous affairs. We will assimilate you. And Dave was very into Star Trek too. And there's this one episode where one of the Borg gets loose and they individualize them and then they send him back into that big box and he blows up the entire society because it can't handle having an individual in it. And I think that's very much how Dan saw our reporters going into CBC.
Yeah.
So, I think we could dedicate an entire series to all the ways that Dan David changed journalism. But I'm wondering, how does his legacy live on at APTN and, in the journalists whose lives that he's touched?
Well, I mean, like for me, I learned so much about leadership from him. A lot of people get into management or higher up positions and they think, okay, well, I'm the boss and now I'm going to tell everybody what to do. And like I said, Dan wasn't like that. So you learn how to be humble and you learn that you don't have to I don't know how to say it, like walk around pretending to be bigger than you are. Like that's not what management is there for. It's there to listen to people who have the best ideas and try to get anything in their way out of their way so they can be the best that they are. I mean, I learned that off Dan. Whether or not I executed as well as he did, I don't know. But I mean, I would have been a completely different person if not for him. I would have never gotten into journalism. I was, like, even when they were diversity hiring, as they used to call it, they would never pick somebody like me because diversity hiring back in those days meant, they wanted people to look on TV and see a brown face. And they weren't expecting anybody to do the news any differently or to have like, you were supposed to do your job just like any other reporter would do it, meaning white reporter. But people could look and say, "Oh, there's a brown person." And so that was diversity to them. And honestly, that's what I thought diversity was because I didn't know any different until Dan came along. Like he really had to teach us that. So I think that that's a big part of his legacy, and I think just beyond the walls of APTN, APTN News was the only place where back in the days that we started, the early days before there was Facebook or Twitter or X or Blue Sky or Instagram or any of these other things that we have now, it was the one place where you could go to feel that you weren't alone. So you're in a community and you've got no school and you've got shitty water and your kids have to go to the outhouse in winter and you just wonder why you're living this way and you go, is it the chief? And then you read something in the Globe and Mail that says the government gives millions of dollars towards that and you go, he must be corrupt or something, my chief. Because what are you supposed to think? This is what you're told. And you don't know why everything's so crappy. And then you turn on APTN and you realize other people are struggling with the same thing. You go, well, wait a second, it's not just us. And it started a bigger conversation about what was wrong with the system. And, at the time we didn't use words like systemic racism, like they just weren't in the vocabulary of Canada. And I think that a lot of what APTN gave to our people was the ability to have those discussions and to know that like that there were things wrong outside their community, that they had things in common with other people. And what they did with that information is things like, "I don't know more." Like it's not our job as journalists to say go out and protest or, burn it all down or, or pray or give up or what are you going to do with this information? It's up to you. We're just giving you things to think about and telling you what's going on. But people did things with that, and that's got to be considered part of Dan's legacy too.
We took what Dan gave us in the beginning, and we're still doing it. And I think that's the biggest part of his legacy. Just tune into Nation-to-Nation, watch our newscast, and you'll see stuff there that you're not going to see on CTV National News or the National on the other channel. That's his legacy. And I think there's one more thing too. Dan was pushed out of APTN. He was not treated well by our own senior management team of the day, none of whom are around anymore. Dan was still around. Dan was still coming back. But the fundamentals that he gave us, we are still using today, and that's evidenced by our products, our newscasts, our current affairs programming. It's all there. It's all there. And I think we owe it all to Dan.
Yeah, it's a good point. There was a lot of fighting in those early days for the existence of APTN News inside APTN News. And Dan taught us how to fight.
Bruce, Karyn, thank you so much for making the time and joining us for this really important episode.
Thanks so much. It's just so good to talk about Dan. It's so healing.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation, Cierra. I appreciate it.
This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email your suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.